Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so Theo Von had RFK Jr. on his podcast. Another example of how these guys randomly have a ton of access when it comes to this administration, but also why it benefits a politician like RFK Jr. to go on Theo Von's platform, because it's a very softball interview. They go through, Theo Von asks some genuinely curious questions, pushes a little bit, even seems like he's approaching skepticism in certain moments here, and yet just doesn't really push it. And as a result, RFK Jr. kind of just walks all over him, throws a bunch of bullshit premises out there, and also kind of just contradicts himself a few times. So I wanted to go through this because it's honestly a great way to make the case against RFK Jr., his approach to HHS, as well as the Trump administration's approach to governing in general. And the quote that everybody's passing around about this was RFK saying that he used to snort coke off of toilet seats or something, saying that to impress Theo Von. But I didn't even bother with that here because I was more interested in what he was saying about HHS and fraud and all of that. So let's get into that real quick.
Americans did not get obese because they're indolent or lazy or they don't want to do exercise. They got that way because they're being mass poisoned. And they're being mass poisoned because the government lied to them, and it lied about the food.
What were some of the biggest cases of fraud? Like when you got in there and got behind the curtain, see like, you know, like the NIH, the EPA, like just see what's going on back there. What were some of the biggest cases of fraud that you kind of found?
I mean, the biggest cases are we get between Medicaid and Medicare, there's about $100 billion stolen every year. And a lot of it is like what's happening in Minnesota with the Somali community and what's happening now, even worse in California. But, you know, one of the problems is that's a systemic problem is that Medicaid and Medicare now no longer, it used to be that they paid for your medical treatment, your doctor's visit, but now they pay for the person who takes you to the doctor, and they pay for home care, and they pay for, a person to come in and pay your bills, right? So there's all kinds of opportunities for fraud. And a doctor recently, Oz told me this, told Oz, he said that there was a doctor in California that he visited, and the doctor had a patient who was a heroin addict. Heroin addict was coming to see him 4 times a month for some kind of a treatment. And one day the doctor looked out the door and saw his ex-wife waiting for him in the car. And the doctor said, "Oh, are you back together with your ex-wife?" And he said, "No, I hate her guts." And he said, "But she drives me because she gets paid $600 every time she drives me."
Wow.
And he said,
that'll put you back together with your ex.
We make $3,000 a month, with her driving me this, and then I drive her to hers.
Wow.
And so there's all kinds of those opportunities for fraud. As we now know, a lot of the money that was going into the Somali community for autism care, there were these phony autism care houses.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was ending up with Al-Shabaab in Somalia. So hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars were being stolen, shipped to Somalia to fund a terrorist group. But that's happening every day. Now we have the ability to catch them.
How are you able to adjust that sort of thing now? Like what makes it different now?
Because first of all, under the Biden administration, I don't want to get super partisan.
Yeah.
But the Biden administration turned a blind eye to all the fraud. It was mainly going to blue states, and it was an economic generator. There's money pouring into the blue states, and they just said, we know a lot of it's stolen and illegal, but we're going to let it happen because it's coming to us. It's coming to our state. And so what we've done now is with Medicare, we control Medicare. The states control a lot of Medicaid So it's a little harder for us to detect fraud there. We've started out with Medicare. We're using AI, and we're using AI which can detect the fraud. It can tell us whether this guy who we're paying has been convicted of fraud before, and we shouldn't be paying him again. And it will be telling us every aspect of his business that we need to know to understand whether it's fraudulent. So we're going to save just this year tens of billions of dollars in eliminating fraud in Medicaid.
All right, so a little bit later they get into DOGE, and so I have some of that here. But they're talking about some of the fraud here and healthcare, as well as this first thing that he says that I just wanted to slip in there because it's very important for the narrative that he's casting here. He says, Americans are so unhealthy because they've been mass poisoned because the government has lied to them about the food. So that's very specific language that he's using there. The government lied to them about the food. Okay, who's selling the food? Who is feeding the people the food? That's the companies, right, that sell the food. We all know that. Those are the ones who sell the products that are poison. What the government does, and has done in some cases, is green-lighted certain products or not put out information that would be damaging to the profitability of certain companies. So that is corruption that does occur in the interests of those companies. And so the reason RFK Jr. isn't able to say that those are the ones to blame is because he is in a pro-business administration, and that's part of the deal that he made to be a part of the Trump administration. And the truth is, when you're talking about waste and fraud in Medicare and the healthcare industry, a lot of that fraud that's taking place, and certainly the waste, is large companies. And aside from the fact that it's hard for them to detect or to know exactly what is what when it comes to fraud, it's much easier for them to focus on communities that can be cast to be committing a certain amount of fraud rather than the much larger industrial problem that is connected to all of these larger pharmaceutical companies, etc. And those are the people that Trump is pardoning because they're his buddies that show up at Mar-a-Lago, the people that are truly defrauding Medicare and the government for like large sums of money. So if you're really talking about going after the fraud, that's where you would be going. But you can't do that because it cuts into the corporate interest aspect of this administration too much, and RFK Jr. has to stay away from that. So they focus on these narratives about Minnesota, but I mean, RFK really just lies straight to Theo Von's face here in this thing about saying that money is going to Somalian autism care centers, and then that money is going to Somalia and to terrorists in Somalia. That is a complete fabrication. These are separate things that he's talking about. In one case, there is some speculative accounts that money might be leaving Minnesota and going to Somalia in suitcases. And then there are also separate accusations of fraud, and there's been no connection drawn between those things at all. And in the case of the fraud that he's talking about, we all know that that was earlier fraud that was prosecuted during the Biden administration and was a larger thing around feeding our future. And so there are newer allegations of fraud, which so far have led to a few charges and cases and plea deals, but nothing large and systemic like what they're pointing at. So to the extent that charges are coming for that, they're still developing that. And what we have gotten is this surge in Minnesota that led to 2 people being killed and many other immigrants and citizens alike being abused in various ways. So I'll get to that later. But that's really the outcome of the Trump administration's approach to this kind of stuff, because they don't want to spend money on making sure that these government programs are efficient. They would rather either prevent money from going out in the first place, and which has led to crises in the case of SNAP. And then Trump wants to put boots on the ground because of Stephen Miller or whatever. So they're going around and throwing people in the back of cars, beating people up, shooting people, killing people. And that's the Trump administration's idea of enforcement. And when RFK Jr. says that they were just letting the fraud go because it was going to blue states, he's literally talking about a case where the fraud was convicted by the Biden administration, which has not happened yet in the case of Minnesota and these new broad allegations of fraud. And Theo Von asks him, like, what are some of the worst cases of fraud that you've seen? And the worst he can think of is something that Dr. Oz told him happened in California. This guy is the head of the program that he's asking if he's seen fraud in. And so this thing that he's saying about using AI to detect the fraud is very important. And before I get to that, let me show you what he had to say about Elon's program, basically doing the same thing with DOGE and how that all turned out.
I had a friend, Heather, who was working at UCLA. She was a researcher there, and she said that like a lot of during like the DOGE period and stuff, a lot of their grants got cut, and there was like a kind of a, I don't know if it's called a moratorium or like a pause.
There was a pause, and every administration does that. You need to do a review and make sure that those research projects are not, torturing beagles or doing DEI or.
Whenever DOGE happened, right? When DOGE occurred, when Elon was in, or he was involved, or hypothetically involved, that's what it seemed like, just like to the regular
He was
person.
definitely involved.
He was involved. Was that successful? Was that real? Like, what was the outcomes of that? Like, did that seem like were you guys working together with that? Like, what was that all about? I
think even Elon has said that there would have been better ways to do it. And that going after the systemic, what we're doing now, these large thefts, you can cut a couple of thousand people, and over the long run, it's just, drops of water in the ocean.
Yeah.
Oh, that's not going to save us huge amounts of money over the long term, but what we're doing now is going to.
The things you were just talking about, you mean?
Yeah.
That's going to help a lot.
Yeah.
Is DOGE still active? Is that program still active? What were the outcomes of that?
Well, the outcomes were that a lot of, I cut my workforce by 20%. But, in truth, some of those were very good cuts. It would have, I think we all agree, including Elon, that it would have been better to do targeted cuts. Cut the people who were actually causing the problem, and then keep the people, a lot of the new workers who were only there for a couple of months, that it might have been better to keep some of those people and change the culture.
All right, so he's kind of admitting here that DOGE set them back more than anything. And at the beginning, he says, well, all administrations pause all grants. You got to make sure they're not doing any DEI. That's a lie. That's not something that just all administrations do. They might do it in some cases. But just like everything with the Trump administration, this like blanket approach, we're just going to cut across the board. We're going to stop all grants across the board. That's what they do, and it never works. We're going to do tariffs across the board. It's a terrible way of governing, but that's the Trump administration's approach, and it's good to understand RFK's policy within that. Because, like I said, everything that he talks about when it comes to health and what companies do, it seems like he's approaching talking about regulation, but he never quite gets there. And so, when he's talking about AI and we're using these AIs to figure out where the fraud's coming from, that is going to be an exercise in uselessness. I mean, it might be able to do some interesting compiling. The idea that they're going to just use this stuff, they're going to hit a button and it's going to figure out all the fraud and it's going to save us billions and billions of dollars a year. That's exactly what Elon said, and the savings were negligible. So what this AI is supposed to be doing is crawling through all the data of all of these companies and people that this money is going through and figuring out who is who and whether or not there's fraud happening. So I can tell you already that while there may be some successes when it comes to that, it is going to create more work for the people in that agency who are overseeing that process, because that's what AI is doing across the board, is just kind of creating more work. Because while it may be able to perform some interesting tasks, those tasks are not necessarily productive tasks. And so it creates more work for the people who are trying to manage that outcome. So it's going to equal more spending, not just on the staffing to oversee it, but whatever AI program this is. What are we even talking about? Where is this data coming from? How much does it cost? How much taxpayer money is going to this random, no doubt private AI company? And how is that company benefiting from all of this data, Medicare data, sensitive data? So no further information is needed when he just says we're going to use AI to do all of it. That's a very dangerous mentality. And it's a perfect example of how RFK Jr.'s approach to this stuff is fake science. I mean, the AI stuff is not how you sort through things in a numerative and empirical way. And he uses it as a stand-in for a solution at many points. And the reason for that is because it's a market solution. Oh, these are just companies we can partner with that will magically solve all these problems. But they won't. That's the issue. Because these Republican administrations get in and all they want to do is cut back on the funding and they want to cut programs. So all the stuff that RFK Jr. wants to do in terms of transforming the health of Americans is not going to happen because he's not going to be able to make a single dent on any of the market forces that are actually operative there. So what he is going to do, and the outcome of an RFK Jr. tenure in the government, is essentially going to be more room in the market for like the pseudoscience bullshit, the fake remedies, and the cranks and the kooks who are going to be able to basically say that they have government approval or adjacent to government approval. So it's going to be a larger kind of cottage industry of stuff like that that is more legitimized by a government that makes more room for them in the market. It's not going to regulate against the companies who are putting poison on the market, in the words of RFK Jr., but rather they're going to try to just put more supposedly better things on the market. And that's not going to work. And ultimately the companies that are doing what they're doing are going to continue to have market dominance, and RFK Jr. is just going to find a place within that cottage industry and AI weird muck bullshit to continue having a voice. And as far as these like fraud allegations and where all of that goes, like I said, I think it's really just a method of targeting communities, because on the whole, a lot of this fraud, if you're talking about systematic fraud, you're talking about businesses in America that are have a pretty high level of sophistication. So trying to make it about these systems, these detailed and elaborate systems of immigrants that are scamming the system, there might be some things that fit that description in various places in the country, but by and large, that is not who we're getting ripped off by. We're getting ripped off by business owners of all kinds and landowners of all kinds. Those are the people who are running up the check, stealing money from the government when they can, and are very much against the government spending money going after those kind of things. So that's why the solution to this is somebody who recognizes both the need to spend money on programs, getting money out to people, and the government using its tools in that way, and also spending money in the government on efficiency and being able to do those things at the same time. You cannot make the government process more efficient. You cannot catch the fraud without putting money into that process. But especially with Trump, this idea of just cutting things across the board, cutting the head off of certain agencies, even RFK Jr. is saying that that was a bad idea, was a bad approach, but really they don't have anything better than that going forward. And he says, oh, we should have just cut the people who were the real problem. But what do you even mean that they were the real problem? Because you're saying that the fraud is coming from outside. So what targeted cuts could you have made in DOGE that are the real problem? That's just not how it works. And the failure of them to make this spectacle that works in their favor when it comes to Minnesota, I think is going to sting on the immigration front, because their ability to tie all of these things together and say that ICE is an enforcement arm of the government going after things like fraud, these big bad Somalis that are ripping everybody off in Minnesota. All they did was make themselves the bad guys by going there. So that operation has ended. Tom Homan says that they're pulling all of their agents out. Some of them are surely going to stay there, and I think you're going to continue to see the same type of ICE abductions that we have been seeing in Minnesota, but this like targeted boots on the ground approach is over, and they're getting people out of there, and they're probably going to send them to some other city. I think they're probably going to target Ohio next based on what they've been saying. So Tom Homan was in fact sent in there to wrap up this operation and end it. And now that's what they're all saying, is that it's over. And so that's what we get out of this Trump administration. I just want to really hammer the point home that not recognizing that these programs exist in order to strengthen communities, and turning this fraud, these allegations of fraud, into a reason to target communities with violence, abject violence and terror, has only resulted in deaths and really a show of force on both sides, where you kind of got your ass handed to you, and you lost a lot of political capital in the eyes of the public because people saw how your ICE agents are behaving. And what we need is actual governing. and people who are willing to wield the funds of government to actually solve problems and not cut away funding from programs that are meant to solve problems and then put money into programs that throw fire onto the problems. That's the Trump administration approach. That's the ICE approach. And we can fix it. And it's probably going to have to take a major unwinding of ICE, if not abject abolishment. But you can expect, because of the behavior of ICE in Minnesota, you can expect that to result in calls to abolish ICE being some of the most popular political messaging on the stage. And there's nobody to blame for that but the Trump administration, because these are their monsters that they invented and their solutions to those problems that they invented, and so they own the consequences.
Me too close to, too much to do. The mission is too crucial. Shout it out from the rooftops until I lose vocals. Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity.